God's plans and dealings with mankind have always involved a healthy recognition and understanding of authority and a submission and obedience to it. And in heaven, they're going to have equal status. But on earth, God has given us distinctive roles, and He expects us to fulfill those.
Hello, welcome to and or back to my channel. I'm Hello Beastie, and I'm an ex-COC content creator that focuses on the specific religious trauma ex-COC members deal with, and just generally recovering from fundamentalist Christianity. Today, I will be reviewing Aaron Studdard's lesson from the 2019 New Year's meeting. He doesn't give a title, so I've just been calling it Respecting Authority. This is kind of a sidetrack, but I'm not sure how many people outside of my specific brand of COC know what a church meeting is. So just to quickly describe it, it's an event hosted by a congregation that lasts over a weekend, or it can go over a non-religious holiday like the 4th of July or New Year's. There's church every night, and most times in the morning too, at least always on Sunday mornings.
It's too much church. Can't be going to church that much, right? Too much church.
And depending on the size or type, it can have one preacher speaking at every service or multiple speakers per service. Could be a couple hundred people meeting at a local congregation, or it could be a few thousand people meeting from congregations all over at a rented auditorium or something. I used to get so offended when I would try to explain to outsiders about church meetings, and they'd be like, oh, we have those, like revivals. Or, oh, like a convention. And I'd be like, no, nothing like either of those things. We aren't Baptist heathens, we're way different than any other religion. But, I mean, yeah, they're basically revivals. Do other brands of COC have church meetings? Anyway, the theme for the New Year's meeting that Aaron gave this lesson at was From Sheep to Shepherds. And honestly, it seems like the whole meeting was kind of brutal. Going from the lessons I've watched that were taught there, it focused on church leadership, like elders or how to become an elder, but also on how members need to be willing to be led and submit to the leadership that's in place. I'm working on a review of the meeting as a whole because there were several bits of different lessons I wanted to cover, but that will be a future video. Before I go much further, I want to say that I don't intend to send any hate Aaron's way. I don't know him personally, but I do know that people in general aren't black and white. Even though I think there are some serious flaws in the sermon he presented and in his teaching methods in general, my goal isn't to take him down as a person. My goal is to review, encourage critical thinking, and shine a light on how harmful some of the COC philosophies can be. So with that long ass intro out of the way, let's get into it.
But there's something I feel that is a dilemma and crisis in our country today. The crisis I speak of is one where we lack the regard for authority that we once did.
So his lesson is about respect for authority, or the lack thereof. He starts with society as a whole lacking a regard for authority, claims it's because kids aren't being taught to respect authority at home, and concludes that the root cause is a shortage of godly fathers. The reason I picked this lesson to cover is because it's a very good example of how COC preachers make claims from the pulpit with no actual documentation to support them. It was a very frustrating sermon for me to cover, having to listen to it over and over when putting the script together, because he's speaking to thousands of people here and he is so irresponsible with what he's presenting. For example,
I think we're all probably be in general agreement this morning when I say that we're living in a broken culture. Sociologists and anthropologists will tell us that one of the indicators of the health of a culture is how the younger generations treat those in the older generation.
The problem with this is, I have no idea where he got that from. He's made a claim with no specific source or anything. He's just throwing it out there. 9 out of 10 scientists agree ageism is ruining our society. This is a logical fallacy called appealing to authority, specifically appealing to anonymous authority. A valid authority is one that can be checked and whose statements can be verified. His claims can't be researched or validated because he's given no information on which specific sociologists and anthropologists are telling us that and where they say it. This is what I mean about being irresponsible in what he's presenting to his audience of a few thousand people. The whole lesson he throws out experts or statistics, but doesn't support or source any of it. I used to think this was like factual evidence. I respected the authority of those in the pulpit and trusted the information being preached. I had no idea until I got to college about citing sources or confirmation bias, or that 96% of statistics are 84% fake 78% of the time. The church's method of teaching, standing at a podium and yelling at the audience for 25 minutes, is one of the most inefficient ways I can think of to teach. I mean, it's great for cults, but it's not really conducive to teaching people how to evaluate the truth of what's being presented to them. By the way, it's not super relevant to the points that I want to make in this review, but I was curious to see if I could find what actual sociologists and anthropologists are telling us about the health of a society, and I couldn't find much about what he was saying. But I did find an interesting read in an article from the New York Times where a journalist interviewed people who actually study collapsing societies and the causes of those collapses and how we can apply that information to today's times. I put a link in the description in case anyone else was also interested.
Today, whenever parents harmonize with the disdain that goes on in the government, we teach our children that really authority is only as good as long as we agree with it. Today, whenever we look at our teachers and our police and our lawmakers in the country, we begin to look at them as a society as public enemies instead of the people who've been given leadership positions over.
Is it just me, or is his lesson weirdly political? One of the things he says during this part is, when you turn on the news today, you can hardly turn on and see anyone not throwing insults and hurling injurious statements towards the highest elected officials in our country. This lesson is from 2019, when Trump was still president. And to me, it almost seems like Aaron is a closet Trumper. Closet because the church doesn't believe in voting. Even so, they're very big on members respecting the government. They believe that people who are in power were put there by God. So like, if you vote, it's like a vote of distrust in God. Like you're not trusting him to put in the right leaders. Even further, if you voted for the person who ends up losing, it's like you voted against God. It makes absolutely no sense. I believe it's harmful because not only does it rob members of the control they should have in picking their representation in government, but it teaches them to think that they have no control over any representation or leadership in their lives, and they should just submit to those with power around them. Also, isn't the whole goal of a government to represent the people? The people we elect into those offices are there for us. It's not so much a leadership role as it is a representation role. If those in government stop representing the people accurately, or if they're doing something the people don't agree with, we have every right to hold them accountable and to voice our disdain. We should hold them accountable. Doing that isn't a lack of respect for authority. That's just how government is supposed to work. What kind of dictator-ass country does he think he lives in?
God's plans and dealings with mankind have always involved a healthy recognition and understanding of authority and a submission and obedience to it, and this begins very early in the home.
So now we're getting to the part of his lesson where he claims that kids aren't being taught respect at home. Because honestly, it's a lot easier to teach children compliance than it is to try to teach it to adults. The vibe of this section of the lesson really reflected the overall vibe that I got from a lot of the lessons at this meeting. Not so much from sheep to shepherds, but more, how good of a sheep are you? If you can get a majority of your membership to associate respect for authority with obedience to authority, then you can use that misidentification of respect against them anytime they try to call you out for abusing your authority. If the question being asked is always, how good of a sheep are you? Instead of things like, how good is your shepherd? Members are not being equipped with the tools that they need as people to identify and report power abuse when it's happening. It creates a very toxic environment that I know people with authority in the church have taken advantage of, and probably several more that I don't know of firsthand.
You know, this is a sad qualification for many men today, for I have known men myself who in every other regard that we've discussed here this week have made fine leaders in many cases and places, but because of the actions of their family and the things that their home life represents, have been disqualified from the highest leadership position in the church. It's a sad circumstance when that becomes the case, and many people may think that that's sad and unfair. But I want you to know that God demands that His people not conform to this world, but prove what is good and acceptable and perfect, the will of God, Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says, and that includes our leadership and our families.
This kind of always gets to me, hearing stuff like this, because I know that my dad wanted to be an elder. Even though I'm much better mentally now, I recognize that it's an entirely unrealistic and unfair thing to put on myself, I do sometimes feel bad for taking that away from him. I hate being seen as a black mark on his parenting report card. How my choice to leave the church has affected my family is probably the thing that messes with me still the most. Also, something he does a lot in this lesson is subtle brainwashing. It's not locking people in rooms and torturing them until they change the way they think, but when he says things like, you might think this is unfair, but God demands that His people not conform to the world. That's brainwashing light. Anytime you have a thought or feeling that doesn't agree with the COC version of the acceptable and perfect will of God, instead of correctly learning that it's you discovering a new moral value that you hold, you learn it's an immoral thing and you're conforming to the immoral world. Statements like this are super common in the church, and he says things like this several times in his lesson. Hearing stuff like this over and over for years, you learn that you can't trust yourself in any regard. That the only way to know the rightness of any single thought in your head is to have it externally confirmed by the COC. Trust yourself. If something seems sad or unfair to you, know that those are okay feelings to have, and you should explore why you feel them. People have different values based on how they think and what's important to them. Letting those shape your boundaries and interactions with the world is not you conforming to the world. It's you interacting with your environment in a way that makes you feel comfortable and based on your internal core values. Just because the church says something's not the right way to feel doesn't mean that you have to shut it off. And honestly, it's unhealthy to shut it off.
The lack of diligent and godly fathers has created a plethora of society's problems that we see today.
This is where he tries to support his conclusion that a lack of godly fathers is the cause of not only the disrespect kids today show authority, but just generally being responsible for a lot of our current society's problems. But I'm not going to play out all the statistics and claims that he throws out, because again, he doesn't provide literally any support for any of this. For example, he says that 43% of our youth today will grow up with no father in the home in this country. Okay, where did he get that from? Who performed this count, and when and what were the circumstances of their data collection? Does it include kids who have two moms? I'm not going to go through and try to rebuttal each of his claims when he doesn't even bother to support them for me to do proper research. Like I said back at the beginning, this is an entirely irresponsible way to teach a group of people. Like, I can just say that 74% of kids are happier in homes where they're raised with no religious beliefs and are given the tools to evaluate and determine their own belief system. I've supported my claim just as much as he did. Kids raised in the COC are 10 times more likely to suffer from anxiety and depression. Boom. Debate won. I made those up, by the way, just to be clear. I entirely made those up to prove a point. Also, every single child statistic or claim that he throws out in this section is gender neutral, except this one. This is from his points of how much better kids are when the father is in the home.
The girls are far less likely, it says, to engage in promiscuous sexual behavior before marriage.
Why not just throw some sneaky slut-shaming in for all the ladies out there?
Manhood and masculinity have been under attack for a long time now in this country. As a matter of fact, traditional masculinity has now been labeled as toxic. The American Psychological Association tells us that traditional masculinity is psychologically harmful. The forces of political correctness now have villainized traditional gender roles in our country.
Remember earlier when I was talking about the appeal to authority fallacy? It's pretty ironic that he uses some vague experts to support his claims early in his lesson, and then halfway through he's saying we can't trust these other experts when they tell us that traditional masculinity is harmful. Peer-reviewed materials from experts tell us what we believe and enforce might be harmful? Nah, the way that we interpret the Bible is definitely what's best for humankind. Psychiatrists today are just letting society's PC culture rule their lives. But at least he's given me somewhat of a source this time to investigate. I mean, I have no idea what specific work he's referencing here, but I can at least review what the American Psychological Association has put out there about traditional masculinity. I went to their website and did some reading, and he is right. When you search masculinity, a lot of the articles and books listed talk about how traditional masculinity can be harmful to men and to society. For me, I'm one to form my opinions based on what multiple experts who have studied in this field for years have to say about the subject, as opposed to Aaron, whose expertise comes from working in the school system for however many years. One book that is hella expensive but had a summary listed on their website for free looks pretty interesting. It's called Men's Gender Role Conflict, and just to quote a bit of the summary, men's gender role conflict is a psychological state in which restrictive definitions of masculinity limit men's well-being and human potential. Gender role conflict, GRC, doesn't just harm boys and men, but also girls and women, transgendered people, and society at large. I hadn't actually heard of gender role conflict before, but this one O'Neill dude created it in the 80s, and it's a pretty interesting theory. It studies how gender roles can have negative consequences on people and can result in personal restrictions, devaluation, and/or violation of others and self. It's something I've just scratched the surface on, but I do plan on researching deeper. Unfortunately, a lot of the information that I found when putting this script together was locked behind paywalls. But I did put a link to O'Neill's profile at the University of Connecticut in case anyone is more interested in learning about him or his research. Anyway, Aaron goes on along the same line.
But what it's created is a modern vision of manhood today that's weak, that's silent, that's passive, at a time in our country when we need the opposite of that. We need men who are strong and proactive and courageous, and yet humble and obedient in God's service so that they can lead their families the way that God would have them to be.
This is a side of the church's teachings that I don't have a lot of experience with. If any men or women who grew up as men in the church would like to share in the comments about how the traditional gender roles forced on them affected their mental health, I'd love to hear your stories. No pressure though. I'm also on Twitter as @TheHelloBeastie and on Reddit as hello_beastie. if you want to share but would rather not do so publicly.
And I understand that there's 18 states now that if you don't want to be a male or a female, you can choose the letter X to go on your driver's license so that you don't have to affiliate with either one of those. We need to know that God created both male and female whenever He created this world and inhabited it with creatures, and both are equally loved by God. We need to understand that. Both are equally loved by God, and in heaven they're going to have equal status. But on earth, God has given us distinctive roles, and He expects us to fulfill those. He expects us to recognize His authority and then to submit to the authority that He's placed over us.
Imagine being a young girl in the audience and hearing that you're not equal. That, yeah, God loves you, and someday after you die, He's going to treat you with equality, but right now, He expects you to submit and obey. Imagine being non-binary and being completely and casually invalidated in just part of a sentence. It's tragic. It fucking breaks my heart. It's weird. I remember the official COC stance explained a little differently when it came to gender roles for women. I don't really remember being told in so basic of terms that the COC doesn't consider me to have equal status with a man. I mean, obviously it was implied and it was practiced that way. Thinking back, I do remember preachers would literally put on whiteboards, God, men, women, when they preached on this stuff. But they would always say the roles were different but equally important, or something similar. In a way, it's weirdly validating hearing Aaron say it so plainly. Even though I do mean it when I say it's tragic. But I just mean, like, at the time, I thought it was just going over my head. It didn't feel equally important, but I thought maybe it was me not having enough respect for the role that God gave me. Or maybe I didn't understand because I had a worldly attitude and I secretly wanted to be in control. I wonder if I would have been upset by Aaron's lesson if I had heard it back when I was in the church. Or did I hear statements as blatant as this all the time back then and just had too much stuff internalized to hear how messed up they sounded? Also, just to be clear, there is nothing wrong with wanting to feel in control of yourself in your relationship. It's not like worldly or immoral. It's healthy and it's natural. The way the church teaches relationships should be shaped is entirely toxic. Healthy relationships don't have a power imbalance, and your significant other should be your partner. It's extremely harmful and offensive to tell women that they aren't equal to and need to be submissive and obedient to the men in their lives.
Modern feminism movement would tell us that the distinction of these roles no longer exists. I heard a very fitting quote about feminism not long ago that said that feminists wanted the power of men and then the privileges of women, but the responsibility of neither.
First, where did he hear that quote? Who said that? It would be nice to know. I googled it and it looks like it may have been a tweet by some random dude. Let me know if you know where this originated from. Second, of course we want to keep the privileges of women, whatever he's even referring to. All modern feminism wants is for the equal treatment of people. We just want every person, no matter their gender, to be treated as an equal person. We want to let men also have whatever exclusive women privileges that you're talking about. Third, that quote recognizes that men have power that women don't, but then it just goes the complete bonkers direction of feminism wanting women to have it, but not the responsibility that comes with it. Again, whatever the fuck that means. We're not Spider-Man, dude. We're just looking to challenge the systematic inequalities women face on the daily. Feminism doesn't try to destroy gender roles. It's about choice. Everyone deserves to choose whether they have to conform to gender roles or not. Be a housewife. Be a manly man. Just don't tell others they have to do the same thing. It's about choice, and it's about our system equally supporting everyone in their choices. As long as they're not harming other people, of course.
For those of us who are going to raise children in a society that does not regard authority, we want to talk about three things today that God expects and yea, even demands of those that would be fathers in His family.
It's basically provide for your family, discipline your kids, and raise them to be good Christians. Honestly, this bit is almost half his lesson, and there isn't a lot to cover that doesn't rehash points I've already made. So I'm just going to skip past it to the end.
We have to get back to acting like men, as Paul told the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And if we ever expect the church to fulfill its mission in our generation, we need to step up and tend to the sheep that are in our pastures first.
To me, this entire lesson reads like a teacher who got pranked by his students, so he's lecturing them on the importance of respecting his authority in the classroom. I disagree with his entire lesson, from the manipulative and dishonest preaching methods to the offensive and invalidating opinions he presented as facts. I guess the point of me covering this lesson is to encourage people to question the authority and leadership around them, to let them know that it's okay and it's not showing a lack of respect. Like, it's not a lack of respect to ask why or to point out when something said or done by an authority figure makes you uncomfortable or doesn't make sense. Just because a person in authority tries to invalidate you does not mean that you are not valid. If you're having doubts about the COC or just fundamentalist Christianity in general, you aren't alone. I'd recommend going through recoveringfromreligion.org's website. I'm going to put a link to the description, and there's a lot in there that could help you if you're looking for someone to talk to or just for more information. Thanks so much for watching. And remember that the world is a huge and inviting place full of so many accepting people. You don't have to be separate from it. There's room for you in it if you want in.